I ran away at 17 because of my father. 9 years later my mother finds me asking for money because he's dying. Do I forgive, help, or finally close the door for good? I don't know why she found me. She stood on my doorstep like a weathered postcard from a life I thought I'd mailed away forever. Hair thinner, eyes rimmed with tiredness, the same crooked coat she'd worn when I left, smelling faintly of hospital soap and stale cigarettes. For a second I thought someone had made a mistake. Then I saw her hand clutching the threadbare bag and the way she avoided looking at me, and everything in me tightened. I left home when I was 17. I left because the house was a trap, doors that slammed like judgments, a father whose temper turned small mistakes into punishments, the kind of man who believed control was love and fists were discipline. He hurt us, mostly me. My mother. She took the hits that weren't meant for her but couldn't protect us in the ways that mattered. I begged her to leave with me. I cried until my throat hurt. I promised we could start over, that I would work 2 jobs, that we could build something better. She listened and said she was scared. She stayed. I left. It's been 9 years. I don't speak to them. We had almost zero contact after I walked out. I wanted distance like oxygen. Every call I ignored, every message I deleted, felt like a boundary I finally had the right to set. I learned to feed myself. I learned to manage small apartment bills and bigger office politics. I learned to make coffee that tasted better than the bitter stuff at my mother's house. I learned to be alone and to prefer it most days. So when she appeared on my doorstep the other morning, tired and trembling, with the smell of nicotine and disinfectant, I froze. The thing that surprised me most wasn't that she had tracked me down. People find each other, but why? She didn't come with soft eyes or apologies. She came with a request, and the request was a price I didn't know I would pay with more than money. "Your father," she said, voice thin and almost everything at once. He has cancer," they said. Her words wavered. She looked like someone being asked to jump without a parachute. I had no idea. I sat her down because I couldn't have her fainting on my floor. I made coffee like I knew how, offering a silence big enough for the truth to fit into. She told me how his cough had gotten worse, how night sweats left him soaked, how the doctor used a word they both heard like thunder, metastasis. I listened, felt old and small all at once. Then she asked me for help. Not for healing, not for forgiveness, for money. She wanted me to pay for treatments, for bills, for whatever would keep him alive, and she asked with a kind of pleading that felt like a knife. She expected me to give because he was my father. She expected me to set aside the years of scraping myself together and the wounds I carried like currency. It was as if nothing had happened, as if broken promises and bruises could be cashed in for compassion on credit. The outrage was immediate and raw. I wanted to tell her to get out, to go back to the man who raised fists like words. I wanted to ask why she had never learned to be brave for us, why she had chosen to stay and made me walk away alone. I wanted to scream. Instead I made an ugly, small, practical decision. I told her to leave, then called a friend to calm myself down. I told my friend about the visit and the ask, and he told me not to feel pressured. He said I could do what felt right for me, that no one could force me into being kind. That comforted me like a thin blanket. But the world didn't stop there. It rarely does. The question planted itself and grew. What do I owe blood when blood hurt me? What debt does love demand that I pay with my life? A couple of nights later, unable to sleep, I texted Laura. Laura's been in the margins of my life for months. She's smart, quick, and inconveniently kind, the sort of person who listens as if people's words had weight and deserved attention. I'd been seeing her for a little while, enough that she had started to know the edges of me. She knows the story in patches, the leaving, the abuse, the silence. I hadn't told her everything. Some things I still kept wrapped and hidden as if unwrapping them would expose me to the cold again. When I told her about my mother, her voice softened in a way that made room even for my anger. "You can't bury people and then be surprised when they come back asking for coins," she said, but gently. "That doesn't mean you have to open your doors to them." Later, she sent me a message that refused to leave my chest. Sometimes being a good person isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing every time to do what you can to make things right now. If you can help, help. If you can't, That's your limit. But don't let revenge write the only chapter of your life. I read it 3 times. Those words lodged themselves in me like small, surprising seeds. I called a few friends the next day, people who knew me but weren't inside the memory. Their answers were messy and human. One friend said, "Let it be, let fate decide." Another said I should help out of basic decency even if my heart didn't forgive them. A cousin shrugged and said, "You're 40% right," meaning we all carry contradictory instincts. It's strange how advice can create pressure even when it's meant to release it. I felt tugged in a dozen directions. My anger said no, my empathy whispered maybe, and my mind tried to balance both like a tired accountant adding up debts I never owed. I agreed to see my mother again, for coffee, a neutral space where the past could be purchased with small talk and black roast. She arrived with more apologies and less armor. She was shrunken and raw. The first thing she did was cry, and it was honest and terrible and exactly the thing that made me flinch. "I don't know how to do this without him," she said, voice breaking. "I didn't know how to leave. I thought staying would keep you safe. I thought if I stayed, he'd leave you alone. I thought I was doing the right thing." I wanted to list for her the nights I hid bruises with long-sleeved shirts, the times I swallowed apologies she should have given, the way my 17-year-old hands trembled over a backpack zipper as I packed myself away. I wanted to make her feel each year I had to become someone quick and small to survive. Instead, the words came out rough and jagged. "You chose him," I told her. "You chose the man who hurt us. You chose fear over me. You stayed." She flinched at that, and for a moment I half expected the old machine of denial to snap back into place. But then she showed me something I hadn't noticed before. Fear. Not the performative fear of someone keeping up appearances, but a crushing, dizzying fear, the kind that makes people believe the only option is to hide and keep the pieces intact. She told me she had no education, no job skills, that leaving meant, in her mind, a dangerous unknown. She said she couldn't imagine surviving without him, and that the thought of stepping into the world alone felt like a free fall. It didn't undo anything. It didn't excuse everything. But hearing her reasons shifted something in me. The anger didn't evaporate, it rearranged. I thought about the nights she might have spent negotiating with her cowardice. I thought about the little trade-offs, the quiet sacrifices that didn't feel like compassion at the time but maybe were attempts at containment. "Why didn't you try?" I asked. "I tried in the ways I could," she said. "But I didn't know how to be brave on my own." I remember the moment I let my hand touch hers across the table. It was awkward, like two people who had forgotten the choreography of affection trying to find the beat. I didn't forgive her in that moment. I couldn't, but I began to understand that the map we both had been following was flawed, drawn by fear and old promises. When she left the cafe that day, she asked me one last, terrible thing, to come to the hospital and see him. To sit at his bedside. To say the things families say when they hover near the edge of losing someone. My heart clenched. I told her I needed time. I told her I would think about what I could do. On the way home, I drove slowly, as if speed might force a decision. It didn't. That night I lay awake, 100 possible surrenders and rebukes spinning in my head. The argument that I owed them nothing, that they were architects of my pain, was clean and savage. The argument that I could choose to act with decency regardless of the past was gentler but no less demanding. Neither felt like a solution. Instead, they felt like two stubborn neighbors claiming the same patch of land. I write this now because the question sits like a foreign object in my chest. Do I honor the family that hurt me by not abandoning them when they are vulnerable? Do I honor myself by keeping the distance that protected me for years? I am trying, clumsily, to carve space for both. I have made no decisions yet. I told my mother I would consider how I might help with medical bills without promising a reconciliation I am not ready for. I told myself I would not be coerced by guilt. I told Laura, who listened in the quiet way that makes wild things feel less wild, and she held my hand like an anchor. There are nights when I imagine driving to the hospital, sitting in a plastic chair, watching a man who once made me small breathe shallowly. There are nights when I imagine the relief of letting him go and keeping my own boundaries intact. Both images hurt and both feel, in their way, correct. For now, I keep things close and honest with the people who stand beside me. Laura, a handful of friends. I have money. I make enough that helping is possible without ruining my life. That complicates everything. It means the choice is moral, not survival-based. It means my decision will be a statement about who I am, not merely what I can afford. I don't know if forgiving is a sacrament I must perform, or a practical step toward living without the weight of the past. I don't know if supporting them financially will heal anything, or if it will simply prop up a dangerous pattern. I don't know if my father will live through this, or if any of this forgiveness will even matter if time takes him first. All I know is that the door is open, and I am listening now in a way I wasn't before. I'm not sure what I'll do. For now I make coffee, and I try to breathe through the parts that want to scorch everything to ash. This is where I am, caught between the man who made me leave and the son who still remembers childhood lessons of mercy, even when mercy feels impossible. It's been 9 years since I left. My mother found me at my doorstep and told me my father is dying of cancer. She asked me for money for his treatment. I froze, angry and torn. I called friends and talked to Laura. Her words, that being good sometimes means acting despite the past, lodged in me like a seed. I promised to think. I agreed to meet my mother for coffee again, and the conversation cracked open old wounds but also revealed a fragile honesty. I left the cafe without a decision, still holding the question. A few days after she first showed up, I started making phone calls I had been avoiding for years. Not to family, but to people who had seen the edges of my life and stayed, friends who watched me learn how to be careful. I needed perspective that did not come with the gravity of memory or the messy loyalties of blood. The first friend I called told me to lock the door emotionally, that some people earn their distance and you do not owe them repair. The second said that if my heart could help, maybe it should. Life is short and kindness is not always earned. The answers were scattered, as varied as the people giving them. Tomas said, "You walked away for a reason. Don't let guilt or a hospital bed rewrite the past." He spoke with a hard kindness that comes from knowing your own limits. Priya, who works at a hospice, offered a quieter perspective. People can act in contradictory ways when they face the end of life, she said. It does not always make them good people, but it makes them human. The end of life is messy, and decisions made in that context are rarely clean. I did not call Laura first. I texted her on a lazy afternoon, half hoping she would not answer and half hoping she would. When she picked up, she listened like someone with the patience to hear everything. I told the story haltingly, my voice shaking at points. She kept me anchored with small questions. "How do you feel?" she asked, and that was the honest question I had rarely permitted myself to answer aloud. After I told her what happened, she did not lecture. She did not make a dramatic plea for forgiveness or demand I be noble. She said, "You do not have to be noble to be kind. If helping aligns with the person you want to be, do it. If it will hollow you out, then do not. But do not let the past decide the only future you are allowed." That sentence landed differently than any advice from friends or the judgments I had imagined. It offered agency without erasing my pain. For the first time in days, I felt a small looseness in my chest, the tiniest reprieve from the fight between anger and obligation. A week later I agreed to meet my mother again. She arrived at the cafe carrying a thick folder of paperwork, hospital bills, diagnosis reports, insurance forms, and she trembled in a way I had never seen before. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if years of fear and compromise had worn her down. We sat in neutral territory, the kind of cafe where strangers could disappear into the steam of their drinks. She told me about the diagnosis and the nights spent at his bedside. She described the cough that would not stop and the way the bills multiplied until they felt like a physical weight. The more she explained, the more complex her choices seemed. She confessed she had been afraid of leaving because leaving could make things worse. She believed that by staying she could keep him focused on her and therefore keep me safe. "I thought I could be the buffer," she said, staring at her cup. "If I kept him angry at me, he would leave you alone." The logic was terrible, and yet it was rooted in a kind of desperate calculation. Listening to her, I realized her choices were born of survival rather than love. That did not excuse what happened, but it helped me understand the shape of her fear. I unloaded the parts of me that still felt raw. I told her about nights I hid bruises beneath long sleeves, about packing a bag quietly in the dark, about walking until the city swallowed me. I told her how it felt to be the child who begged and was not chosen. My words were sharp because they needed to be accurate. She apologized in the small, breaking way that people apologize when they have finally recognized the harm they have caused. She admitted the truth. She was terrified, and her fear had led her to make choices that hurt me. "Why didn't you come find me?" I asked, the question that had lived inside me for 9 years. "I was afraid you would hate me," she said. "And I didn't know how to leave safely. I thought that by staying I was keeping you safe." Her answer was blunt and incomplete. It did not absolve her, but it explained why she had remained in place. There was a moment when I wanted to push a plate across the table and walk out. Instead, something in me shifted. The urge to punish sat beside a tenderness I had tried to bury. Forgiveness arrived in its own form, not as a grand, sudden redemption, but as a slow unclenching. I realized forgiveness did not require forgetting. It required accepting a complex truth. People can have been both harmful and the product of fear at the same time. "I forgive you," I said quietly. Saying it did not erase nights or make wounds vanish. It made the present different. It allowed me to stop measuring every choice against an old ledger and to consider what kind of man I wanted to be now. She began to cry, and we hugged, awkward, tentative, honest, like two people relearning the language of touch. After the cafe, I drove her to the hospital. The corridors smelled of antiseptic and low patience. He looked thinner and paler, a man whose threats had dissolved into small human frailties. He reached for her hand with a weakness that used to be a demand. I stayed long enough to feel the reflexive fear, and then I left. I could not let proximity to him become a performance of reconciliation. On the drive home, I thought through what I might be willing to do. I could help without opening a door for him to step back into my life. I could provide financial support for treatment without consenting to visits or pretending everything was okay. That felt like a compromise. It protected my boundaries while letting me act from who I was now rather than who I had been at 17. That night I called Laura again. I told her how the meeting had gone, and she listened in that steady, careful way that made me feel less alone. Then she surprised me with a small bravery of her own. "You did the hard thing," she said. "You faced them and did not dissolve into an extreme. You made a decision that respected you and offered compassion. That is not small." Her words warmed me and gave the plan shape. Practicalities followed. We spoke about conditions, controlled financial transfers to cover medical bills, insisting that any direct contact be mediated through me or a social worker, and a clear expectation that my mother would pursue resources and assistance if she wanted to leave him. It was not heroism. It was a list of terms that might prevent old patterns from repeating. I fell asleep with a plan that felt like a first draft. I did not imagine perfect resolution. I imagined steps that might allow me to be generous without being consumed by the past. Forgiveness felt less like erasing the history and more like redirecting the energy I had spent carrying it. In the morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen, and I felt a mix of relief and grief. I had forgiven something I had every right to keep frozen, and I had set limits. The road ahead was uncertain. Would my mother actually leave him? Would he accept help without exploiting it? Would my act of compassion be enough? I did not know. But for the first time in years, the question felt like an invitation rather than a trap. My mother found me after 9 years to tell me my father is dying of cancer and asked for money. I called friends and Laura, who helped me think. I met my mother for coffee, confronted her about leaving me, forgave her in part, and drove her to the hospital. I set boundaries. I would provide financial help directed to medical care only, and I would not let my father back into my life. I waited to see if she would act on her promises. After I decided to help, I set strict terms. Money would go directly to the hospital or to approved medical services. I would not hand cash to anyone. Any extra requests would require documentation and review. I told my mother I would not visit my father, that I needed to protect myself, and that if she wanted a place in my life she had to be separate from him. The line I drew felt severe but necessary. It kept my dignity intact while allowing me to be humane. She agreed, voice breaking and fragile, and I believed her because for the first time she answered with specific plans instead of vague pleas. It felt like tiny architecture, a sequence of small commitments that could, if built correctly, turn into something stable. I coordinated the first transfer with a hospital billing contact and a social worker who specialized in family cases. Everything went through official channels. When the payment landed, I felt an unexpected swing of relief and guilt in the same moment. Relief that help was on the way, guilt for the strange satisfaction that came with keeping my hands clean. The weeks that followed were full of practical checks. My mother sent appointment confirmations, proof of outreach center attendance, and brief notes from a counselor. Those documents were not evidence of moral purity. They were evidence of motion. She took small steps toward independence, applying for temporary work, attending a group for women who had endured control, and speaking in a counseling session about fears she had never named. Each time she shared proof, I let my skepticism ease a degree. I also watched for signs that old patterns might reassert themselves. Once I saw a photo of them together in the hospital room, his hand near her shoulder, and the reflex anger spiked. The instinct to show up and shout old truths flared, but I held back. I knew being present physically would not necessarily grant me any moral victory. It might simply recreate the loop I had spent years escaping. So I kept my distance and let my mother report back. If she slipped, I would notice. If she kept going, the distance would remain intact but softer. Laura stayed close during this time. She did not perform grand gestures. She cooked me dinner when I forgot to eat and listened when I replayed hard moments because talking through them loosened their hold. Her presence was steady in a way that felt different from the chaotic ties of family. One evening she said, "Boundaries are not cruelty. They are self-respect." She didn't say it like a judgment. She said it like an observation. It helped. Months passed like weather, some bright, some stormy. Treatment cycles brought moments of hope and setback. Financial paperwork accumulated into a small but real trail of receipts showing payments, scans scheduled, and medications approved. I made transfers with an eye toward keeping the help specific and limited. I was careful to balance my compassion with practical caution. My mother continued to send proof of progress and the occasional voice note thanking me, and in those quiet messages I heard a presence that felt both humbled and newly determined. Then came the day she asked to meet for dinner. I thought it might be an attempt to reopen old wounds, but I accepted. She arrived healthier than at the hospital, as if brief stretches of autonomy had given her a small reserve of strength. She sat down and placed a packet of paper on the table, job leads, contact numbers for local programs, and a letter from her counselor. She had organized the documents in a way that suggested planning rather than pleading. "I have started," she said, looking at me with a combination of shame and a tentative pride. "I want to leave him when I can. I am trying to build a life where I can be steady on my own." The words were awkward but sincere. She explained the steps she had taken, and she described a plan: short-term work, an outreach program, and an arrangement with a women's shelter for temporary housing if needed. None of it was a miracle. It was small and realistic. Dinner that night was strange in a way that felt good. It was not drenched in apologies or morbid confessions. It was about housing options, bus routes, and how to manage a budget. We negotiated like two adults who had avoided negotiation for a long time. When the check came, she reached out to touch my hand, and the motion felt less like possession and more like a timid reach for partnership. I did not pull back. Laura showed up without much fanfare, the way someone who cares simply arrives. She sat quietly and watched the conversation, smiling in that small way she does that makes me breathe easier. After dinner, we walked together. The city felt alive in that ordinary streetlight way. When Laura took my hand, it was a simple gesture: warmth, choice, and proximity without demands. That night, at my apartment, we talked not about the past but about the near future. Weekend plans, who would bring what to the grocery list, how we liked our coffee. It was small and domestic and perfectly restorative. We kissed with a softness that felt like permission to trust again. The tenderness between us felt like a corrective to a life tuned to alertness for danger. It was not immediate fairy tale healing. It was a slow, steady repair. I continued to maintain my boundary with my father. I did not attend his bedside. I did not answer please meant to manipulate me back into a role I had outgrown. I informed my mother plainly, if she wanted to be part of my life, she needed to make a clean separation. She said she would, and kept proving it with documents and small actions. This was not a cure-all. This was a conditional restoration, trust earned step by step. Over time, the evidence suggested things were changing. My mother completed several modules at the outreach center and landed temporary work that covered rent for a few months. She reported less time spent at the hospital and more time at appointments for job training. I sent funds for specific needs, a month's rent, medical co-payments, and a counselor's fees. I insisted the transfers be documented and routed through official channels. It felt clinical, but it kept the boundaries clear and preserved my intention. There were nights when old alarms woke me, moments when a stranger's shout on the street would rearrange my breathing. Memory is stubborn. That is part of being human. Yet those nights became fewer. The reflex to flee softened because I had built frameworks that allowed me to help without dissolving. I learned that compassion is not a binary switch. It can be practiced with limits and still be sincere. Laura and I grew closer in quiet ways. We argued about the small stuff, smiled at each other's flaws, and planned little trips that were more about being together than grand adventure. She listened to my stories without trying to fix them, and sometimes that was the best kind of medicine. One evening, after we had cooked dinner together and washed dishes as a kind of domestic choreography, she rested her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm glad you kept your line." It was gratitude without triumphalism. Now, as I write this, the future is still not a clean line. My father may recover a while or he may not. My mother may continue to build a life apart from him, or fear may pull her back. I cannot guarantee outcomes, nor should I be asked to. What I can report is the shape of my choice. I chose to help in a way that honored my past wounds and my present boundaries. I chose to forgive in measured ways, but not to forget. There's a lesson in all of this that I didn't expect. Mercy and boundaries are not enemies. They can coexist. You can choose to refuse intimacy with those who harmed you and still be generous from a distance. You can hold your dignity while giving what you can. It isn't always clean, but it feels like an honest way to live. So, this is where this part ends. I helped in the ways I could, I kept my limits, and I opened a small space for the people I love to change. I'm not naive about the future. I'm realistic and cautious. But I'm also less lonely. Laura is there, and my mother is tentatively learning independence. My father remains outside my life, and I intend to keep it that way. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.